My name is Insiloy Mark Adrian, CA 200 Section D. Now, I'll be talking about the institutional-based correction. From the word institutional-based correction, we will learn how to correct, how to punish, and how to rehabilitate the offender, even if they are offender, but still we must to punish and deter it in reasonable way. So what is correction? Based what was I googled it, it refers to the branch of criminal justice system that deals with individuals who have been convicted of a crime. The role of the correctional system is to ensure that an offender's sentence is carried out, whether it's time in jail or prison, probation, or community service. It means that corrections focus on rehabilitation and regards inmates as patients who need treatment and guidance in order to become productive and responsible members of society upon their release. Also, corrections, a concept which describes both a wide range of diversified programs, agencies, and institutions, because in correcting offenders, there are many facilities and institutions that will correct, punish, and rehabilitate the offender. In 2018, the Philippines held the 6th highest prison population out of 21 Asian countries. As of 2019, the Philippines population rested at 108.31 million people, and 215,000 of those people were incarcerated. Therefore, the Philippines has an incarceration rate of about 200 per 100,000 citizens. There are 933 prisons running in the Philippines. Unfortunately, there are mismanaged and overcrowded. So here are the five facts about the Philippines incarceration system: severe overcrowding, pre-trial detainees, high death tolls, vigilante justice, and corruptions. Number 1, severe overcrowding. Rodrigo Duterte won presidential election in 2016. He promised to end crime within 6 months. This promise also include the killing of thousands of criminals. Duterte's elections led to the famous war on drugs and eventually overcrowded prison. Manila City Jail, the largest city jail in the Philippines, is split into dorms that safely house 170 inmates. Currently, these dorms house around 500 people. Similarly, a room designated for 30 people holds about 130 in the Quezon City Jail. This severe overcrowding in the prisons leads to illness and death tolls in the thousand. Since taking office on June 30, 2016, Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte has carried out a war on drugs that has led to the death over thousands of people over time. Mostly they are urban people. The killing have been attributed to the Philippines National Police. Duterte and other senior officials have instigated and incited the killings in the campaign that could amount to crimes against humanity. Second is pre-trial detainees. According to the World Prisons Brief, 75.1% of incarcerations within the Philippines incarceration system are pre-trial. In 2018, 141,422 of 178 prisoners were pre-trial detainees. Unfortunately, many people are serving sentences without convictions. Pre-trial detention is found in judicial system all over the world. In countries like the Philippines, people may serve time that overweights their crimes. On average, prisons in the Philippines are detained for 9 months without being sentenced. Number 3 is high death tolls. About 5,200 inmates die annually at the New Bilibid prison. According to Ernesto Tamayo, the hospital medical chief, these deaths are due to overcrowding, dirty living conditions, and inmates violence. At a 2019 Philippine Senate hearing, Tamayo said that there were uncontrollable outbreaks of pulmonary tuberculosis. In addition to overcrowding, poor living condition, and inmate violence, NBP lacks nutritional food and basic healthcare. On accounts of this living condition, Tamayo reports that at least one prisoner dies at New Bilibid each day. Thankfully, politicians and prisons employees are working to reduce overcrowding in the Philippines prison. Human rights advocates have also called for the release of vulnerable inmates, hoping to protect them from poor living conditions. After his election in 2016, the president launched a hard-line campaign against illegal drugs personalities, claiming the Philippines had become a narco state. The president's spokesman, Salvador Panelo, told BBC News, "The government does not want to kill. It is not the intention." However, the president himself, has said he would personally take the lives of millions of drug users, and there have been reports local police forces have been given targets to meet in terms of the numbers of deaths. Number 4 is vigilante justice. Duterte's war on drugs escalated during his presidency. Jobless citizens were recruited to kill anyone suspected of dealing, buying, or using drugs. This was one of the few ways for some people to make money. Many homeless and impoverished people joined the vigilante team. In 2016, Duterte told the public, "If you know of any addicts, go ahead and kill them yourself." Together, the Philippines Police Force and unidentified gunmen have killed 7,000 known drugs dealers and users since Duterte's presidency in 2016. Philippines' war on drugs has created a belief that extrajudicial violence and murder are necessary to fight crime. But the Human Rights Watch has turned the narrative around on Duterte. They are publicizing information about the vigilante justice in the Philippines. Number 5 is corruption. In August 2018, the public learned a former mayor may have been released from prison for good behavior. He was originally charged for rape and homicide in 1993. Similar stories of corruption in the Philippines prisons continue to emerge. In September 2018, the public learned that a woman was told her husband's sentence would be shortened if she paid 50,000 pesos. Later that year, senators stated that inmates could live like kings for a fee. These informations lead to further allegation. Prison workers and officials were taking bribes to distribute contraband to inmates. The contraband in questions included cigarettes, cell phones, and television. Supposedly, inmates can also pay for personal cooks and nurses. History of prison. From the birth of modern civilization in 3rd millennia BC, almost every major ancient civilization used concept of prisons as a means to detain and remove personal freedoms of incarcerated people. Inmates who cannot afford a better life within the prisons are stuck in overcrowded and dirty rooms. These inmates have a higher rate of becoming ill and of death. Now that the corruption has been unearthed, officials are taking steps to weed it out, one prison at a time. In those early periods of history, prisons were often used as temporary stopgap before sentencing to death or life of slavery. But as time went on and our civilization developed, prisons started morphing into correctional facilities that started implementing the concept of rehabilitation and reform of prisoners. In addition of holding convicted or suspected criminals, prisons were often used for holding political prisoners, enemies of the state, and prisoners of the war. Way back at that time, in a particular time, if you are convicted and then you are poor, you will be prisoned into dirty rooms and overcrowded. Then if you are incarcerated people, you've been enslaved you've been slave to any persons who have a high ranking, and then that will cause you to ill and of death. Now the advanced now the uh, developing of civilization, it develops also the prisoner reforms. uh, Now if you are incarcerated, if incarcerated people, one prison at a time. The earliest records of prisons come from the first millennia BC, located in the areas of mighty ancient civilization of Mesopotamia and Egypt. During those times, prisons were almost always stationed in the underground dungeons, where guilty or suspected criminals spent their life either awaiting death sentence, or a command to become slaves, or often working as a galley slaves. In the Mesopotamia, early back then, the prisoners were prisons into dungeons, and they were guilty or suspected criminals spent their life either waiting death sentence, or often they were slave working as a galley slaves. Exceptional from the rule comes from the homes of modern democracy, Greece. Their prisoners were held in the poorly isolated buildings, where they could often visited by their friends and family. Primary source of their detentions were not dungeons, high walls, or bars, but simple wooden blocks that were attached to their feet. Uh, fra- sa Greece, they were not using dungeon, high walls, but they were using wooden blocks that even your friends can visit. Even your friends, they can visit it. Ancient Roman Empire, however, continued to use harsher methods. Their prisons were built almost exclusively underground, with tight and claustrophobic passageways and cells. As slavery was accepted norm in those days, majority of prisoners that were not sentenced to death were sold as slaves or used by the Roman government workforce. One of the most famous uses for slaves in Roman empires was gladiators. In Roman, if you are convicted, you are being slave. You've been used as a workforce of a Roman Empire. Some of them are used as workforce ng sa ilang dula sa atong they were called them as gladiators. They will used by the Roman Empire as a workforce. In addition to fighting in the arena, or sometimes after lifetime of training in the special gladiator training houses or ludices, many slaves were tasked as a support workforce that enabled smoother run of their popular gladiators business. The most famous gladiator battleground, the mighty Colosseum Arena in Rome, had a slave army of 224 slaves that worked daily as a power source of the complicated network of 24 elevators that transported gladiators and their wild animals opponents from the underground dungeons to the arena floor. The condition in the European prison remained harsh until English royalty started being more involved with their justice system. Because European people or persons, the way they punish their convicted persons or persons who committed a certain act that is against their rule, the way they punish it is so harsh, so very harsh. So English royalty started being more involved with their justice system. So dire na mosulod si Henry II. Henry II commissioned the construction of first prison in 1166, together with the first draft of English legal system that is used concept of jury. One of the most historic prisons legislation was introduced in 1215 when King John signed Magna Carta, which stated that no man could be in prisons without a trial. With the rise of the industry between 16th and 18th century, English prisons became overcrowded. and new penal measures started being implemented, military pardon. So, penal transportations, or during the end of 18th century, over 50,000 prisoners were transported from England to penal colonies in North America and Australia. Penal transportation to Australia peaked in the 1830s and dropped off significantly in the following decades as protests against the convict system intensified throughout the colonies. In 1868, almost 2 decades after transportation to the eastern colonies has ceased, at last convict ship arrived in Western Australia. In addition, the majority of convicts were transported for petty crimes. More serious crimes such as rape and murder became transportable offenses in the 1830s. But since they were also punishable by death, comparatively few convicts were transported for such crimes. Approximately 1 in 7 convicts were women, while political prisoners, another minority group, comprised any of the best known convicts. Once emancipated, most ex-convicts stayed in Australia and joined the free settlers, with some rising to prominent prison in Australia society. France even continued their practice of penal colonies until the middle of 20th century, or most notably in French Guiana and its infamous prison Devil Island. So, Devil Islands, French Île du Diable, rocky islet of the Atlantic coast of French Guiana, the smallest of the 3 islands du Salut, about 10 miles or 16 kilometers from the mainland and the Koro River mouth. It is the narrowest strip of the land, about 3,900 feet or 1,200 miles long and 1,320 feet or 400 meters broad, mostly covered by palm trees. Part of the penal settlement, the island housed the convicts' leper colony until the LSD Salute were made a maximum security area. The island's most famous prisoners was Alfred Dreyfus, a French army officer unjustly condemned for treason, who arrived on April 13, 1895. He was released on June 5, 1899, having a written journal and more than 1,000 letters in captivity. Dreyfus was succeeded by the political prisoner and during the World War I by spies and desertees, chiefly from tropical countries and not of a French birth. Transportation of prisoners to French penal colonies were abolished by a decree of June 17, 1938, although the last prisoners did not leave Devil's Island until 1953. So that was the Devil Islands in French. Next, Russia also used remote penal colonies in the frozen northeast Siberia. Siberia was long used as a penal colony by Russian government. Probably from the 16th century, the state used troublesome subjects, common criminals, palace revolutionaries, and political dissidents to populate and develop this frontier. Although some Siberian exiles were condemned to forced labor, other offenses were given a degree of liberty remarkable in Tsarist Russia, since there was a little possibility of escape. Exile mined for gold, built Trans-Siberian Railway, and were forced into many other public work projects. Others contributed to the study and cultural development of Siberia. The age of modern prisons that we know today started with their several prison reforms in the 19th century England. By the dawn of the 18th century, prisons, or gaol or jails, have been part of England's criminal justice system for hundreds of years. Gaols were typically small, usually housing only a few prisoners at a time. They were rarely purpose-built and were often in the remains of an ancient castle, keep, or a single room in a gallerist's home. Oversight and inspections were lax and conditions, often dark, filthy, and harsh, were unseen or ignored by the vast majority of the populace. Prisoners had to pay fees upon entry and release, and for food, clothing, bedding, and etc. while in prison as a galleries often run and goes as money-making operation. During that time, prisoners started receiving more care. Concept of rehabilitation was introduced and a government around the world, especially in UK and US, started reconsidering the reviews on solitary confinement, or which has primary source of the increased number of insane, suicidal, and Catholic prisoners. The penal system in the United States developed under the two separate systems known as Urban System and Pennsylvania System. The current system of solitary confinement was derived originally from Pennsylvania model, which was characterized by isolation and seclusion. Evidence has shown that Quakers and Volunteerists supported solitary confinement as an alternative form of punishment. At that time, it was meant to provide a prisoner with solitude, or to reflect on his misdeeds and restore his relationship with God. Solitary confinement was intended as an alternative to public flogging, which were common at that time in 1818. New York reformer and friend Thomas Eddy lobbied for inmate labor, and solitary confinement is a place of other forms of punishment such as hanging. Shortly after, New York decided to include solitary confinement and inmate labor into their penal system. In continuation, wars that engulfs the world in the beginning of 20th century brought the formation of a large amount of war prison camps and concentration camps. Most famous example of those types of prisons happened during World War II, when Nazi government formed over 3,000 detention centers in which political opponents, Jews, Gypsies, criminals, and others were detained without judicial process. Majority of them was eventually killed on an unprecedented massive scale that is today estimated to be between 11 and 17 million people. During the end of 20th century, modern prison system was finalized. Concept of provision service was introduced in 1991. 3 years before that, first prisons intended solely for the holding of inmates in permanent isolation was formed. Thus, supermax prisons became widespread across the entire United States, with over 40 of them being active in the year 2005. Inmates in those prisons are held in 23 long-hour periods of self-isolation, with occasional communal yard time, work, educational programs, and meals in a cafeteria. Since ang pag-abot sa modern prison system, the concept of provision service was introduced in 1991. Ang mga prisoners, wala na sila dili na kayo harsh ang ilang life in prison, because kanang na-improve na ang prison into modern system. Then sa prison po dili na sila ingong harsh na ilang pag-priso. Nanay mga occasional games, for example, ang basketball, soccer, and other games like chess. As of 2006, it is estimated that over 9 million people are in prisons worldwide, with the United States leading the rate of incarceration, or 743 per 100,000 people. Now, religions rule in prison. Throughout the long history of corrections, religious persons and religious institutions have great influence the treatment of offenders. For centuries, churches were among the first institutions to provide asylum for accused the criminals. The actual establishment of prison, that penitentiaries were religious areas that allowed the offenders to obtain finance for his crimes, make amends, and convert while being isolated from others. But probably the most significant influence was the establishment of a regular chaplaincy. Correctional chaplains were among the earliest paid non-custodial staff and were the first to provide education and counseling for inmates. Currently, many correctional inmates practice the religions on individual basis or within the structures of an organized religious program. Religious programs are commonplace in jails and prisons, and research indicates that 1 in 3 inmates participate in some religious program, during their incarceration. In addition, imprisonment under church jurisdiction became a substitute for corporal capital punishment. In medieval times, the Roman Catholic Church developed penal techniques later used by secular states such as monastic cells that serve as a punishment place for criminal offenders. Now, next to be discussed is correctional administration. From the word administration, it is leadership. Correctional administration, study of practice of a systematic management of correction. Correctional administration are frontline supervisor responsible for maintaining clean, safe, and orderly jails and prison. Many work in the federal prison systems are correctional institutional administrators. Although correctional administration is challenging, the Federal Bureau of Prisons suggests that a career in corrections offers a rewarding opportunity to change life for the better inside a correctional facility. Correctional administration involves managing personnel, budget, and buildings. Duties include hiring, training, and supervising correctional officers to ensure enforcement of rules and humane treatment of inmates. Other duties entail facilities inspections and strategic planning. Policies and procedures of facility are reviewed to ensure compliance with Department of Corrections regulation as well as state and federal laws. Next is correction as a process. Refers to the reorientation of the criminal's offender to prevent him or her from repeating his deviant or delinquent action without the necessity of taking punitive action, but rather the introduction of individual measures of reformation. The correctional as a process begins at sentencing. From the time an offender is initially assessed through case management and to supervision in the community, there is a team of dedicated professional working closely with the offender. Correctional programs are offered to help offenders take responsibility for their actions. They are encouraged to learn the skills necessary to help them return safely to the community. A range of motivational strategies are used to help offenders to see the value of participating in this program. The correctional process does not end with the offender's release. It continues in the community. Similar to the dedicated team with the institution, offenders work in a case management team that may include a parole officer, healthcare professional, volunteers, and entire network of support. Next is penology defined, the study of punishment for crime or of criminal offenders. It includes the study of control and prevention of crime through punishment of criminal offenders. So, what is why it's necessary to study about penology? Because in the past, katong silang Lombroso Caesar, and Jeremy Bentham, nag-study sila about itong sa barbaric way of punishing a convicted person. Kung makasala man ang usa ka person, directly sentenced to death penalty or even slavery. Then from our criminal justice system continues to advance na karon greatly atong criminal justice system, they don't only punish a person directly, they have naghimo pa sag mga full process, both offenders and defenders. Kung ang offender ba nagama ba og crime or ang complainant na ga-complain pa siya kung naghimo ba ang offender og crime against the complainant. So penology not just to punish the persons who is convicted of a crime. It includes the study to control and prevention of crime through punishment of criminal offenders. Dili lang ilang i-punish ang offenders, but ilang i-control para kay dili man ta maka-deprive sa life, freedom, and liberty of a person without due process. Kay kung imo ra nang idirekta og kilang person directly to death penalty, ma-question ka sa human rights. So now atong criminal justice dili lang nag-concern po siya about sa criminal person. Dili lang directly ipunish ang criminal, but ilang gi-process, ilang gi-investigate both both offended party and defended party. So that was how nang pag-advance ang atong criminal justice system today. Etymology of the word penology. The term is derived from the Greek word poin, as well as Latin word pena, which means pain or suffering, and logos, which means study. Penology is otherwise known as penal science. It is actually a division of criminology that deals with prisons management and the treatment of offenders, and concern itself with the philosophy and practice of society in its effort to repress criminal activities. So, from that paragraph, ang penology dili lang to punish a person who have convicted in a crime. Ila pong gi-control ang convicted person, or in case mabalik siya sa community, dili na siya mo himog kuan, dili siya makahimog crime, but i-control na dili na siya makahimo og someday crime sa society. So that was the real meaning of the penology. So next is correction and the criminal justice system. The criminal justice system is the machinery of any government in the control and prevention of crimes and criminality. It composed of a five pillar of justice. So corrections, there is involvement in the criminal justice system. As I recall, in our crime 200, the five pillars of criminal justice system here in the Philippines are law enforcement, prosecutor, judiciary, penology, and community. So when talking about law enforcement, dito ka mo file a complaint against a person na imong i-filean og complaint. Then sa prosecutor office, dito i-recap kung ang person na by probable cause sa iyang criminal act. Dito pod ang preliminary investigation. So ang penology for correction, rehabilitation and treatment of offender kung ang criminal offender found out guilty. Then community, kung paghuman sa penology, kung kay dito sa penology i-correct siya, dili lang i-punish but i-correct, so that sa community pagbalik na niya sa community, makontrol na dili na siya maghimo og crime in the future. Correction, as one of the pillars of criminal justice system, is considered as the weakest pillar. This is because of its failure to deter individuals in committing crimes, as well as the reinformation of inmates. This is evident in the increasing number of inmates in jails or prison. Hence, the need of prison management is necessary to rehabilitate inmates and transform them to become law-abiding citizens after their release. From that paragraph, correction is one of the weakest pillar of criminal justice system. This is because kanang pag-increase sa number sa population. Since mag-increase man ang continuous man ang pag-increase sa population, may possible na magkahuot na dito sa magkahuot na sa mga prisuhan. Napay uban na I heard gani diri sa atong Philippines, I heard also dili lang diri sa Pilipinas but outside na pag you are much money, pwede ra nimong mabaryan ang imong sala since it's not good. Dapat if you are convicted person and example nakagama kag murder, you must be punished according to what you do. So mo po na yung sa karason na nganong wikis ang pillar kay very I can say unfair, or it may be bias in terms of power. Kay some mga like mga politician pwede ra sila makabayad sa ilahang nahimong sala, and that's was the reason correction is the weakest pillar in the criminal justice system. Next is historical perspective of corrections. Important dates and events in the history of correction. In 13th century, securing sanctuary, a criminal could avoid punishment by claiming refuge in church for a period of 40 days, at the end of which time he was compelled to leave the realm by a road or path assigned to him. In 1468, England, torture as a form of punishment became prevalent. Then 16th century, transportation of criminals in England was authorized. At the end of the 16th century, Russia and other European countries followed this system. It partially believed overcrowding of prison. In 17th century to late 18th century, death penalty became prevalent as a form of punishment. Next is reason why death penalty became the usual punishment during this period and thereafter. One of the reason is death of outlaws became a protection for English people. It is because the people during this period did not totally believe yet in the ability to a strong police force to combat criminals. Second is people lack confidence in the transportation of criminals. Gaols and galleys became center of the corruption and effective instrument of punishment. Third, doctrine of crude intimidation appeared or seems to be a logical form of threat in order to deter or prevent the people from violating the law. Fourth, the assumption was that the ruling class is tasked to protect property rights and maintain public peace and orders. The system of maintaining public order had little consideration, or it did not recognize the social and economic condition of the lower working class. The lawmakers and enforcers used death penalty to cover property loss or damage without further contemplating the value of life of other people. Next to be discussed is the primary school of penology. Number one is the classical school. The classical school, it maintains the doctrine of psychological hedonism or free will, that the individual calculates pleasures and pains in advance of actions and regulate his conduct by the result of his calculation. Next school is the neoclassical school. The neoclassical school, it maintained that while the classical doctrine is correct in general, it should be modified in certain details. Since children and lunatics or insane person cannot calculate difference of pleasure from pain, they should not be regarded as criminals. They should be free from punishment. Next school is the positivist or Italian school. The school that denied individual responsibility and reflected non-punitive reactions to crime and criminality. It adheres that crimes, as any other act, is a natural phenomenon. Criminals are considered as sick individuals who need to be treated by treatment programs rather than punitive actions against them. Next is the brief history of correction in the word setting. The early codes. In the prehistoric times, there were no written laws to regulate human conduct. However, men still find ways to avenge themselves from harm and injury caused by another. They designed their own system of justice according to what they believed was right and fair based on their way of life, belief, and the norms of their times. Since civilization year ago was not so high, but there are people magumara gyud mga certain actions that can against sa ilang mga against sa society or sa mga kapwa nila tao. So na yung mga so di na may mga tao na continue sa ilang mga crime na ilang ipangbuhat. So na certain person na bisag dili written ilang mga laws na nagama sila, katong mga I think mga hari sa una naghimo sila own laws, mga codes to regulate those human conduct, para in case ma-punish and ma-convict ang person who criminally doing things in their society. So one of the earliest code is the Code of Hammurabi. The Code of Hammurabi is believed to be the earliest written code of punishment, and Hammurabi, the king of Babylon during the 18th century BC, is recognized as the first codifiers of law. The next code is the Hittites. The Hittites existed about 2 centuries after the reign of Hammurabi, and they were eventually conquered Babylon. The laws of the Hittites may also be characterized as brutal, just like the Code of Hammurabi, because they use death as punishment for many offenses. The next code is the Code of Draco. The Code of Draco is considered to be the first written law of the Greek civilization. This was codified by Draco, an Athenian lawgiver who is considered the first legislature of Athens. It is a 7th century BC. This code is known for having severe penalties. Next code is the Code of Solon. Solon, also an Athenian, was appointed archon and was given legislative powers. During his time, he repealed almost all laws of the Code of Draco and created laws that provide just punishment. Next code is Rome's 12 tablets. Roman law began with the 12 tablets, which were written in the middle of the 6th century BCE by the Decemvirs. It was written in tables of bronze, and it became the foundation of all laws in Rome. Next code is the Lex Salica. The Lex Salica refers to the legal custom of the ancient Germanic tribes which invade and defeated the Roman Empire in the Middle Ages. When the Germanic tribes codified the Lex Salica, they set out the schedule of monetary compensation for wrongdoings called bots. The next code is the Law of Islam. The laws of Islam can be found in the Quran, the holy book of the Muslim religion. These laws are also believed to be of divine origin. It is believed that they were given by Allah to the Prophet Muhammad. The next early codes are the Bloody Code. The Bloody Code refers to the systems of laws and punishments of England between 1688 and 1850. Its name was derived from the nature of the punishment imposed by said laws for so many crimes. The usual punishment provided for many crimes during this period was death. Next is the earliest prison. In the ancient times, imprisonment was not an actual punishment. An offender was locked away while waiting for the actual punishment to be imposed by the kings or by whoever was authorized to impose the punishment. Later on, imprisonment became a form of punishment for lesser offenses, or thus offenses that were not punishable by death or corporal punishment. One of the earliest prison is the Mamertine prison. An underground prison was constructed as early as 640 BC by the Roman king Ancus Martius in Rome. Another earliest prison is the Le Stanche, the first ever public prison in Europe, which was constructed in 1297 in Florence, Italy. The next early prison was Hospital of St. Michael, the first cellular prison or prisons with individual cells for prisoners in Rome. Built in 1704, it was built for delinquent boys under the age of 20 and considered one of the first institutions to house juvenile offenders. Next is the development of prison in England. The origin of jails can be traced back to England during the time of Henry II. In 1166, he mandated that there must be a jail in every country, shire headed by its sheriff. During said period and earlier, jails were called gaols. Next, one of the development of prison in England was the Newgate Prison, built in 1188, also by Henry II. By 1783, it had become London's main prison. Gallows were also installed outside but near the prison for public execution of convicted offenders. The prison was operational until it was closed in 1902 and demolished in 1904. Next is the Wymondham Prison, England's first penitentiary constructed in 1785. Next prison is the Bridgewills. It houses street beggars, vagrant, petty thieves, and prostitutes in the streets of London and engage them in a hard labor as punishment. So next to be discussed is the important personalities development of prison in England. So one of these is John Howard in 1773. John Howard was appointed Sheriff of Bedfordshire, a local gaol in England. His experience as sheriff exposed him to the terrible condition of jails in England during his time. He is introduced the term penitentiary, which is still being used up to this day. So for continuation, the state of the prison in England and Wales, book written and published by Howard in 1777. This book was instrumental in making the terrible condition of English prison be known to the authorities, which paved the way for the reform that were badly needed to be implemented not only in England but in other countries as well, including America. So, in addition, many of Gaull's ideas and proposals for reforms were incorporated the English Penitentiary Act of 1779. These reforms were secure and sanitary structures, jails inspectors, elimination of fees, and emphasis on reforming prisoners. This is why Howard is considered one of the first prison reformer. Ironically, Howard died to typhus or gaol fever while visiting prisons in Russia. So the next important personalities was Jeremy Bentham. Was an English philosopher and social reformer who known for the principle of utilitarianism. He applied this principle when he made the Panopticon, a prison design he proposed to be built in England in 1787. Next person is Alexander Maconicci. Captain Alexander Maconicci was a retired naval officer who was appointed superintendent of Norfolk Island in 1840. An English penal colony, which is a part of Australia, he was responsible for the establishment of a mark system. He is recognized as the father of parole. Next person is Sir Walton Crofton. Sir Walton Crofton was the director of the Irish prison system who used Maconicci's mark system as template for his own system called the Irish system in the 1850s. So here is the Irish system of Sir Walton Crofton. One is beginning with 9 months of solitary confinement. 2 is a period in which convict could earn marks through labor and good behavior. And 3, transfer to an open pre-release prison when they have accumulated the necessary number of marks. And lastly, a ticket of leave. Next is the transportation as punishment in England. In 1597, England passed a law authorizing transportation of offenders from England to other newly discovered lands or English colonies. So next to be discussed is the development of prisons in the United States of America. So one of these, the Pennsylvania. As a colony of England in the 17th century, America used the Bloody Code of England as well as its system of punishment, except in Pennsylvania. Next is William Penn, the founder of the Quakers colony. In 1682, he founded the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and becomes its governor. He made imprisonment and hard labor the punishment for most crimes and reserved corporal punishment for murderers only. Next is New York Thomas Eddy. A penal reformer in New York, he repealed the Criminal Code of England, abolished capital punishment for almost all offenses except murder and treason, stopped the use of corporal punishment, and instead built prison for offenders. Next is the Newgate Prison. Established in Greenwich Village, New York in 1797, but it proved to be unsuccessful because it was too small for growing numbers of offenders being imprisoned. Next is the Walnut Street Jail. The Walnut Street Jail is regarded as the first jail in America. It was built in 1776 and was located in Philadelphia. A penitentiary is supposed to be a place where inmates inform themselves through reflection and remorse. However, conditions worse years after until it was finally closed in 1835. The next to be discussed is the Western State Penitentiary and the Eastern State Penitentiary. So, Western State Penitentiary opened in 1826 in Pittsburgh. However, it was agreed upon that its design was so terrible that they decided to just demolish it. It was demolished in 1833. So, next is the Eastern State Penitentiary. Constructed in Cherry Hill, Philadelphia, finished in 1829, and its designs proved to be so superior than Western State Penitentiary that it became a model for a mini prison in England and Europe. So next is the New York system or congregate system. Similar to Pennsylvania system in terms of requiring complete silence for all inmates to all times, where inmates are in a solitary confinement at night and during the day. They are required to work in groups or in congregate. Next is the Elmira Reformatory. It's an institution that gives emphasis to reformation or rehabilitation of young adults and to segregation of juvenile offenders from adults, hardened criminals. Lastly, Zebulon Brockway. Its first superintendent who devised a system in which prisoner could earn marks or points through hard work and good behavior. When a prisoner earned the required marks or points, his grade or level would be upgraded until he reached the grade that would qualify him to be considered for parole. Zebulon R. Brockway made great strides in reforming the prison system, helping it to become what is today. He was referred to as the father of prison reform and the father of American parole. It took hard work and dedication to Brockway's part to earn those titles, but his contribution to American prison system made that possible. In addition, Brockway moved to Detroit House of Correction, where he was head and began to implement what he believed would be solution to some of the prison problems at the time. One particular incentive he introduced was profit sharing for prisoners. He also pushed for education and moral teaching for prisoners. The indeterminate systems was also introduced, which gave offenders the ability to parole sooner for good behavior. From 1876 to 1900s, Brockway was the superintendent of Elmira Reformatory in New York. This is where he implemented the Elmira system. The focus at Elmira was to rehabilitate first-time offenders at the facility. Offenders worked during the day and received other vocational training for educational at night. As offenders complemented a science or religious program, they could earn points. These points ultimately lead to early release for the offenders via a formal parole program. The idea was a hard work and good behavior would result in an early release from prison.